Education is a popular topic in media and one that stirs considerable controversy. It also seems apparent that the Forum of Journalists has considerable influence on the shaping of education policy by government. In an established line of research, UBC education faculty Michelle Stack and Deirdre Kelly have been exploring the impact of media on policy, the effects this interplay has on students and teachers, and the ways that this debate can be corrupted or enhanced. Their ongoing work has reached wide audiences across North America and continues to find new ways to explore case studies and specific policy developments, as well as bringing deep academic sensibility to an analysis of why these occurrences play out as they do. Today, Professors Kelly and Stack bring theory and practice together in their study of media and education policy on Your Education Matters. Deirdre, would you describe to us your joint line of research with Michelle and why you have selected this?
Sure. Well, we're very interested in the connections between media, education, and policy. And one reason we're so passionate about looking at that is that we see it connected up to democracy. We live in such a media-saturated world, and popular media is really the public square where ideas get hashed out. And but Michelle and I have been concerned that certain groups of people are misrepresented often in popular media or excluded. Certain stories get told and other ones get ignored. And so this obviously has big implications for our democracy. As you said, we're in educational studies, and both of us are ethnographers, which means that we don't stay in the ivory tower. Both of us hang out in schools, shadow kids through their day, interview teachers. So we have a pretty good on-the-ground sense of what goes on in schools. And over the years, I've been struck by students, teachers, parents feeling really some media story will hit the front page of the newspaper, and people are typically very upset because they feel like they're getting misrepresented. And we think that those media representations, they influence us all, but they influence policymakers. And so a good part of my research has looked at youth, and youth are very maligned in mainstream media. Something like half the stories that come out in TV news link youth to crime, for example. So in this sort of environment, it becomes easier to create policies that are, quite frankly, bad policies. One of the ones that I like to give as an example was various states and then Ontario proposed to take away young people's driver's licenses if they were not doing well in school. So, you know, if their grades flipped or what have you, then suddenly they wouldn't be able to apply for a driver's license. And, you know, this would be unthinkable if we were trying to do that to adults. But, and it also strikes me as kicking people when they're down, right? Like, so there's all sorts of reasons that somebody might not be doing well in school, and then to deny them the right to drive a car.
And then that leads us to the question of how that affects the child.
Exactly.
They do that with sports in some places. I mean, obviously, if your grades aren't passing, you shouldn't be in sports, but they'll put a higher threshold and make a student get off the sports teams, and that might have been the one thing that was getting them to come to school.
Exactly, Paul, yeah.
So, Michelle, could you flesh this out a little more for us and help us to understand how education policy is made, how this flow occurs from media through citizens and back to making policy?
Yeah, maybe I'll just start with a bit of my bio. Before I became an academic, I worked in government. I was an advisor to an education minister under the Harcourt government, and then worked as a communications director for what was called the Children's Commission. And one thing that really struck me from day one on the job was that everybody looked at the news clips first. So it wasn't academic articles, it was the news clips. And that had a big impact on my day, because if something negative happened, if there was a big story on education, I would generally get a call from the Premier's communications people saying, what is this? Do something, right? So it really did play a role. And so there was the issue management shop that dealt with the bad news stories, and then the kind of puff piece, the good news stories about education. So that really had an impact on me in terms of looking at when something negative happened, how sometimes policies were created to fix it or to be seen as fixing it. From that, I became increasingly interested in how politicians come to understand education through what they read in the media, and how that affects policies in a number of ways. I've interviewed premiers as well as journalists and former education ministers, and I had one former premier, for example, say to me, oh yeah, media directly influences policy. I used to just hate Mondays. And I said, well, Premier, why did you hate Mondays? And he said, well, my MLAs would come back, they had time to read the papers, and they would say, Premier, you've got to have this policy, you've got to put in a zero tolerance policy or more testing. My constituents are furious, it's in the newspapers. And he said it had a direct impact on the type of policies they introduced, particularly if they had MLAs that were in really crucial areas for getting reelected. So that's how I became interested, was just watching, I guess, on the ground as somebody in government, how it really did influence policy. The media wasn't literally in the room when policy was discussed, but it was always there, as one communications director said to me.
Well, there's some sort of a balance we need to strike between the fact that we are in a democracy and there is such a thing as professional knowledge. Mm-hmm. And so, you know, we can't vote on medical knowledge, for example. Mm-hmm. You have to get the researchers and experts, and same in education. But we're constantly caught in that tension. Mm-hmm. Are we simply going to vote? We see that happening in Texas lately, where mm-hmm. the elected officials are picking the curriculum despite what any historian or other person with special expertise in the field of developing social studies curriculum might want to see in the curriculum and textbooks. So it's an ongoing debate, and that, I guess, is what your research looks at, mm-hmm. how we strike this balance. So help us, again, understand the relationship between these factors and how public education is getting preserved or is being threatened by that relationship.
Sure. Well, the first thing to emphasize is that policy, by policy, Michelle and I do not mean some official statement that's passed from on high and then goes down the hierarchical chain and is beautifully implemented. Anybody who knows anything about policy knows that that is a fantasy, that these things are political all along the way, and that's both good and bad in the sense of trying to influence things. One of the things that we look at is that media itself could be seen as a policymaker and shaper, and Michelle just gave a good example of that.
Maybe I'll just jump
Sure.
in. I mean, one of the things I find interesting is that media, journalists need to have audiences, and politicians need to have voters. And so part of what they look at is what I call a head nod test. So they think about a policy, and it's like, okay, are our readers, voters going to look at this and go, yeah, that makes sense. And a number of journalists I've talked to say, well, I think of my aunt, or explaining it to my grandma, and how would this sell with her? Would it make sense, or would she say, oh, those crazy educators, they don't know what they're doing, right? And so that can influence policy as well in terms of what they see as common sense. So the issue can become that often, journalists and journalists and policymakers and academics are coming from a fairly middle class background. So for example, Aboriginal education often gets told from very much a deficit point of view. Here's what's wrong with Aboriginal people, rather than here's what's wrong with the education system perhaps, or with government funding, etc., that systematically discriminates against Aboriginal peoples, and here's all the exciting things that Aboriginal peoples are doing in terms of education. So that's an example where the biases of the journalists as well as the policymakers can come into play. The other thing that's really interesting in terms of the role of policy is I often ask journalists and politicians, well, tell me a bit about your own personal experience in school. And they're like, oh, that doesn't have any effect on me at all on how I report or policy making. One journalist I talked to, and she said, well, no, it has no effect on me. And then a few minutes later, she goes, you know, I know policies that don't make sense. When I was a kid, they skipped me a couple grades, and it was horrible for me. And I said, so does your personal experience maybe have an impact on how you report? But there's such a focus on being objective that our own emotions don't come in to how policies covered or what kind of policies are created. Yeah. And I think that's really, it's not true. I mean, it's what's happened to us in the past or our families is going to come into play in terms of how policy is perceived by what policymakers think should be the policies in education and how journalists report them.
Yes, objectivity is a very slippery concept. Yeah. I mean, there really can't be any pure objectivity in journalism because it's narrative writing. Plus, there's limited space. I mean, the Internet's helping us with that. But just by selection of what you choose to cover, like the Charter for Public Education has never been covered much in the media here in BC, and that was a choice on some people's part. And so for a voter to objectively evaluate the value of the Charter, it's unlikely to happen unless they find out about it somehow and seek it out on its website. Now, most media have a financial component to them. And I'm wondering if the financial side, the fact that these are for-profit ventures, are most of our broadcast and print journalism, most of all of our media end up being for-profit. Does that enter into this picture that you're drawing of the media's role in public education?
Absolutely. We have tremendous concentration of media in North America. Vancouver has the dubious distinction, I think, of having the highest media concentration. And basically, corporate media is trying to rent eyeballs. So they're trying to put stories out there that won't upset their advertisers and won't upset their most powerful readers, and that does affect coverage. We've seen a hollowing out of the newsroom. Well, CanWest newspaper division has gone bankrupt. So, you know, there are trends that have led to less and less money going toward investigative reporting that might actually break out of some of the usual way that stories are reported, which is kind of on a superficial level and often. And newsrooms rely or start to have to rely too much on press releases from government or, you know, nonprofit that's trying to influence policy by putting their spin on something. So the way to break out of that is to devote some resources to investigative reporting, and that's exactly what we've seen disappearing.
And I think that's something that's really frustrating for a number of journalists. I mean, a number of journalists I've interviewed are really committed to investigative reporting, and they're good at it. But there's higher expectations because they have fewer colleagues, but they don't have less work to do, the ones that are remaining in a number of the newsrooms. So I think it's really important to realize that a number of journalists do really care and do know how to tell stories in a way that's going to be relevant or more likely to be read by the public than, let's say, my article in Education Researcher or whatever. Usually I write and finish with that. So they do have the storytelling ability, and that's where I think academics and journalists need to make more connections.
Well, an example of that might be Janet Stephenhagen's blog that I read regularly myself. We'll return to this discussion in just a moment.
For more than 40 years, the Faculty of Education at SFU has been delivering academic programs that are innovative and responsive. Based on the academic research of our professors and the expertise of practicing teachers from your communities, our programs are designed to meet classroom needs. As a community, we're piecing together a successful education experience for students today and in the future.
Michelle, you and Deirdre advocate critical media literacy in the curriculum of public schools. Could you explain why?
Yeah, I think both of us think that it's central to democracy in a number of ways. I mean, for example, being able to just deconstruct the Fox tagline, fair and balanced. Being able to understand that tagline is part of an agenda. It's part of a very conservative agenda, and it's made to perhaps persuade viewers that it's neutral. So I think part of media literacy is helping students realize that when one party says, oh, that other group, they have an agenda, that they're saying that because they have an agenda too. And so part of media literacy is being able to understand that, being able to understand how language that seems neutral is used to try and persuade people and to try and sometimes mask that there's an agenda. But more than that, critical media literacy is also about students creating their own media. I've taught classes actually with graduate students and high school students working together to create videos. And it's always really fascinating because the graduate students, some of whom saw themselves as very media literate and talked about kids needing media literacy but didn't see themselves as needing it. And suddenly they're like, wow, I had no idea that if I angled the camera this way I could make somebody look really evil, or I had no idea that I was choosing to take a picture that was sunshine and lollipops, and the students wanted to take this more negative picture or a different kind of picture, and that really bothered me. But we were, they were talking about the decisions they made in creating that video, and that led really nicely into talking about, well, why are certain decisions made by corporate media, public media? Why are Aboriginal people represented in certain ways, repeatedly? Why are girls and boys represented in the ways they are? And so it can really open up the world in terms of understanding that, but also creating their own media to talk about voices that are absent, like their stories that are absent, or their community stories that are absent.
I was reading this week an article about a group of activists in the 50s, and they created the term detournement. And that is an explanation of what Fox does with Fair and Balanced. You use the tools of your opposition against them. And of course, Fair and Balanced has always been the watchword of mainstream media that Fox is positioning itself against. Now, the public educators have quite a stake in all of this, Deirdre. And I know that in your studies you have tried to help the profession understand what it can do to be more effective in framing this debate. Could you explore with us some of the conclusions that you've reached?
Well, one of the things that we think is important is for educators to understand how media works and to see where there are openings. It's no surprise that the media is always interested in doing education stories in September when kids are going back to school. The media likes numbers, and it likes photo ops, especially with television. So one of the examples that I like to discuss is it involved the school code of conduct. In 2007, the province passed the Safe Schools Act. And there was a ministerial order that all schools should link their code of conduct to the BC Human Rights Code, which includes 13 grounds, where you're prohibited from discrimination. And one of those was sexual orientation. And a teacher activist saw that this was not really being implemented. It was one of these symbolic policies that we've talked about, as Michelle said, sunshine and lollipops. And sounds good. So he filed a Freedom of Information request and got all of the school policies from all the school boards around the province. And he was able to show that a lot of schools hadn't even heard about this ministerial order. So there's a great picture of him with this pile of stuff that he got through Freedom of Information. And so it made it into the Vancouver Sun as well as Extra West, and got some other media. So that's an example of something that we can do. We can be more savvy about. The media is there to serve democracy, but we have to sometimes muscle our way into the mainstream media.
And of course, this program is in the media too, and we're playing in this ballpark intentionally, and we come at it with a little different spin, and that is that we let people talk for extended periods of time. We let them, like yourselves, explore their ideas in detail. We don't underestimate the attention span or the intelligence of the public, and we think that they're quite capable of listening to an extended discussion. And we want the voice of professional educators. Virtually all of our guests, except some political leaders who influence education, are professional educators, because we feel there's a dearth of conversation by people trained in the field, and their voice isn't heard enough. So as far as I know, we're a relatively unusual program, but we have had our support and continue to do the program, and people like yourselves are gracious enough to come on and share your ideas with us. An example of what you're talking about, I think, in the interplay between media and policy and implementation was the case of the Corans and the social justice curriculum and how they affected it. Could you explore that case study a little with us to give us an idea of how media were employed in that quest by the Corans to see the curriculum better address what they perceived as social justice issues?
I'm going to send that to Deirdre because that's her research project.
Well, that project started with this idea that we should look at news as public policy pedagogy. People spend more time engaging with popular media than they do in school. So it's hugely important, and it frames problems in a certain way which suggests certain solutions. It kind of showcases certain people as policy actors and others as not, critical. So with that in mind, I looked at how the Vancouver Sun and Extra West covered the Coran. The Corans have been on your show, so I won't go into detail about what they were trying to achieve, but it included things like Social Justice 12 and trying to get recognition of gay and lesbian people into the curriculum as one part of it. What I looked at headlines and the way these stories were set up, and it was interesting. The Corans were never mentioned by name, but always as gay activists. The groups opposing the Corans, which were largely conservative social and religious groups, were referred to as parents, concerned parents, angry parents. So in one case, the Sun included a quote by one of the conservative groups calling the Corans a special interest. So they kind of bought into the frame, and I think that was challenged by Extra West, which is a nonprofit. Of course, it's telling the story from its own perspective, but they were able to go much deeper and explore the policies, debates around the policies, why they were being implemented or not being implemented. So I think that we need to think about the role that nonprofit niche media play in getting some of these ideas out there for debate. Because in corporate media, often it's presented as two polarized sides, and you don't really get the depth of analysis into a policy issue.
And we hope that knowledge transfer will occur in your research and that it will come to affect society on a larger level. Could you explain to the public a little bit this concept of knowledge transfer?
Yeah, sure. Right now, actually, Deirdre and I are working on a project looking at academic journalistic engagement. So we're working with academics to try and help them be more comfortable in engaging with media, but also journalism students and helping them look at academic research. So knowledge transfer, I guess, from our perspective is looking at, for example, academic work and how you communicate that in a way that's understandable beyond peers. And I think that one thing we're interested in looking at is the reward structure sometimes in academia is focused on peer-reviewed articles, but maybe not so much on education beyond that. And I think that's really important. I mean, it's important for persuading people to continue to support public education from K to 12 in university, that the way you do that is through media engagement, not necessarily peer-reviewed articles. So we'd like both.
Thank you both very much. We'll be back in a moment. Not everyone is comfortable looking at the motivations of others and their institutions. Social science researchers, however, are obliged to ask such foundational questions. They find there is a chronic problem in the process through which we develop education policy. Political leaders, supported by media voices, may force such policy. These policies neglect the sensibilities of the professional teachers who are charged with policy implementation. The public debates on education policy become shrill and uninformative, opening the door for ill-considered and simplistic silver bullet solutions whose consequences are at odds with their alleged goals. Too often the drive for profit or short-term political gain is shaping the school experience rather than a disinterested concern for our children. Education, a human service profession, is too often manipulated by those interested in profit or partisanship. In response, education researchers are documenting these trends and expressing concern as well as corrective measures. We endeavor to bring you these emerging insights on Your Education Matters.